The chain around my wrists was cold enough to burn, and somewhere above the metal floor, a voice was counting down the hours I had left to live. I did not know the number. I only knew the sound of it, a clicking rhythm from a device bolted to the wall of the holding cell, and every click meant one less breath before they came to take me to the pit. That was what the guards called it, the pit, a place where humans who caused trouble on the transport ships were sent to disappear, quietly, so no one on the upper decks had to think about it again. My name is Nathan Cole. 3 months ago I was a soldier. Now I was cargo. The cell smelled like rust and old rain, though there was no rain here, only recycled air pushed through vents that never stopped humming. I sat with my back against the wall, listening to the footsteps of the other prisoners pace in their own cages down the corridor. Some of them cried in the night. I had stopped crying in the first week. There was no use in it. Tears did not open locks. I had learned 3 things since the war ended, and the losing side became slaves. First, that the aliens who called themselves the Caliph were not cruel for pleasure, only for convenience, which somehow felt worse. Second, that a human who fought back was worth less than one who stayed quiet, so most men and women I had known chose silence to survive. Third, that I could not do that. Something in me refused to go still, even when going still meant living longer. That refusal was probably why I was still awake at the hour they came for me. The door of my cell did not open with the usual harsh buzz of the guard's entry code. Instead, there was a softer chime, almost polite, and then 3 armored figures stepped in, flanking a 4th person who did not look like a soldier at all. She was tall, taller than me, with skin the color of pale moonlight and eyes that shifted between silver and violet, depending on how the light struck them. She wore robes, stitched with patterns I did not recognize, threads that seemed to move on their own, catching the dim light of the cell, like water catching a candle. On her collarbone hung a small crest, a crown split by a single blade. I knew that crest. Everyone on this ship knew that crest. It belonged to the royal line of the Caliph Dominion. I did not move. Moving in front of armed guards usually ended badly for someone like me. She studied me for a long moment, longer than I expected, as if she were reading something written across my face that I could not see myself. The 3 guards behind her shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting this visit to end quickly. "This one," she said, in a voice that was calm but carried easily across the small room. Her words came out through a translator device clipped to her collar, smooth and without accent, though I noticed her lips moved differently than the sound that reached me. One of the guards, an older Caliph with pale scars across his jaw, stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "Princess Ysara, forgive me, but this human is scheduled for the pit within the hour. He attacked 2 guards during transport. He is dangerous." "I am aware of his record," she said. "That is precisely why I am choosing him." The guard's mouth opened, then closed again, the way a man does when he wants to argue with someone whose authority outranks his own by 100 levels. I watched this exchange with a strange, distant curiosity, the way you watch weather from behind glass. Whatever was happening did not feel like it belonged to me yet. "Princess," the guard tried again, softer this time, "the council has already prepared candidates for the ceremonial guard position, trained soldiers, loyal officers, not a prisoner from a conquered species." "The council's candidates are already dead," she said. Her voice did not rise, but something in it sharpened, like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. 3 of them, in 3 months, each one killed within his own quarters, inside a palace meant to be the safest place in this entire star system. I do not need another loyal officer to add to that list. I need someone the assassins will not expect. The room went quiet except for the hum of the vents. I finally spoke, because silence had never suited me for long, even when it should have. "You want a dead man walking to guard you," I said. "That's either very smart or very stupid." She turned to look at me directly for the first time, and something flickered across her expression that might have been amusement, or might have been something closer to respect. "Perhaps both," she said. "Tell me your name." "Nathan Cole." "Nathan Cole," she repeated, Testing the shape of it. You attacked 2 of my guards during your transport here. Why? I considered lying. I considered saying something clever. In the end, I told her the truth, because I had nothing left to lose by it. They were going to hurt someone who couldn't fight back. A woman, a few cells down. I didn't think, I just moved. You risked execution to protect a stranger. I didn't think about the execution part until after. For a moment she said nothing, simply watching me the way someone studies a puzzle they are not yet sure how to solve. Then she turned to the guard beside her. Release him from this cell. He will be given quarters near the royal wing and begin training immediately. Training for what? The guard asked, though I suspected he already knew the answer and hated it. To be my personal guard, Princess Ysera said, and the words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Effective tonight. The guard's scarred face went pale, an expression I had not known Calith's skin could produce. Your Highness, the Council will not accept this. A human, and a condemned one, standing at your side during the succession ceremonies. They will call it madness. They may call it treason. Let them call it whatever they like, she said, and there was steel underneath the calm now. Steel I had not expected from someone who looked so young beneath all that royal weight. I am the one who has buried 3 guards this season. I will choose who stands beside me now, and I choose him. She looked back at me, and for the briefest moment, the royal mask slipped, just enough for me to see something underneath it, something tired and lonely and sharper than anyone in that room had given her credit for. Well, Nathan Cole, she said, would you rather die in the pit tonight or take your chances standing beside me instead? I almost laughed. It was not really a choice at all, not one any sane person would need to think about, but I made myself pause anyway, because something about the way she asked it told me she wanted an honest answer, not a grateful one. Standing beside a princess who has lost 3 guards to assassins in 3 months does not sound like better odds, I said. It sounds like a longer walk to the same ending. It might be, she admitted, but it is a walk you get to take with your hands unchained, and perhaps a chance to decide how the story ends, rather than have it decided for you in a locked room no one will remember. There was something in that sentence that reached past the fear and the exhaustion and touched a part of me that had gone quiet since the war began. The part that still wanted to choose something for myself. Unchain me first, I said. Then we'll talk about the rest. For the first time, the corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that I understood I had just passed some kind of test I had not known I was taking. She nodded to the guard, who reluctantly produced a small key and released the locks on my wrists. The chains fell away with a soft clatter, and I rolled my shoulders, feeling blood return to places it had been cut off from for hours. You understand what you are agreeing to, she said, as the guard stepped back to give us room. The 3 men who held this position before you were skilled soldiers, each one decorated, each one trained since childhood in the arts of protection and combat. None of it saved them. If you accept this, you accept that you may be the 4th name added to that same quiet list. I've already been sentenced to disappear tonight, I said. At least this way, if I go trying to matter for something. She studied me a moment longer, then turned and began walking toward the corridor, her robes trailing soft light behind her. Then walk with me, Nathan Cole. We have very little time and a great deal to teach you before the council notices what I have done. I followed her out of the cell that had been built to be my grave, out into a corridor lined with guards who stared at me like I was a ghost that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. Perhaps I was. Perhaps every step I took from that cell forward belonged to someone I had not become yet. Behind us, the counting device in my old cell clicked one final time and went silent, its purpose no longer needed. Ahead of us lay a palace I had never seen, filled with people who would soon want me gone by whatever means were quietest and most permanent. I did not know yet how close the danger truly was, or how quickly it would arrive. I only knew that for the first time since my capture, I was walking forward instead of being dragged, and that alone was worth more than any promise of safety anyone could have offered me. The princess moved quickly through the halls, and I matched her pace without being told to, some old soldier's instinct already waking up inside me, cataloging exits, counting guards, noting which corridors had cover and which left a person exposed. She noticed me doing it. She said nothing, but I caught her glance, and I understood that she had noticed, and that she approved. Whatever came next, I intended to be ready for it. The collar arrived before the sun rose over the palace towers, carried in on a velvet tray by a servant who would not meet my eyes. It was thin, silver, and cold against my throat when the royal technician fastened it into place. A single line of light traced around its edge, pulsing faintly, like something breathing beneath the metal. "This device is bound to your nervous system," the technician explained, his voice flat, with the boredom of a man who had fitted 100 collars before mine. "Should you raise a hand against the princess with intent to harm her, it will end you instantly. No trial, no warning. It is the standard restraint for any guard drawn from a conquered species." I kept my face still, though something cold moved through my chest at the words "end you instantly." And if I only bump into her in a hallway? "The collar reads intent, not accident," he said. "Do not test that boundary. Others have." I did not ask what had happened to those others. I already knew the answer would not comfort me. Princess Ysara watched this exchange from across the chamber, arms folded, her expression unreadable. When the technician finished and stepped back, she dismissed him with a small motion of her hand and waited until the door had closed before she spoke again. "That collar is a lie," she said quietly. I turned to look at her. "Excuse me? The council believes it will kill you the moment you raise a weapon toward me," she said. "In truth, I had it reprogrammed 3 nights ago. It will monitor you. It will report to me. It will not execute you." I stared at her, trying to understand why a woman surrounded by advisors who wanted me gone would quietly disarm the one safeguard they trusted most. Why would you do that? "Because a guard who serves out of fear of his own collar is not loyal," she said. "He is simply frightened. Fear makes people careless in the wrong moments, and obedient in the wrong ones as well. I do not need a frightened man standing beside me when the next blade comes. I need someone who chooses to stand there. And if I choose wrong? If I decide the collar not working is my chance to walk away, or worse." She met my eyes steadily. "Then I will have made an error in judgment, and I will likely pay for it with my life. But I have watched you since the moment I saw you in that cell, Nathan Cole. You did not attack those guards during your transport because you wished to escape. You did it because someone weaker than you needed protecting, and you could not stop yourself from giving it. That is not the instinct of a man who abandons the vulnerable when it becomes convenient." I did not have an answer for that, not one that would not have sounded foolish coming out of my mouth, so I said nothing, and she seemed to understand the silence well enough. Over the following days, my education began in earnest, and it was unlike anything I had trained for as a soldier back on Earth. A woman named Ilona, one of the few servants in the palace who did not flinch when she looked at me, was assigned to teach me the customs of the Caliph court. She was patient in a way that surprised me, given how little patience anyone else in that palace seemed to have for a human wearing a guard's uniform. "You must never turn your back fully to a noble during a formal address," she told me on the first morning, walking me through the grand hall while servants pretended not to stare. "It is considered an insult equal to spitting on their family crest. You may angle your shoulder, but never present your spine. Where I come from, that's just called being polite to whoever's behind you," I said. "Where you come from is not where you are now," she replied, not unkindly. "Here it can start a duel." I learned the ranks of the nobles by the color and cut of their robes, the meaning behind the small crests stitched into their collars, and which houses held old grudges against which others, grudges stretching back generations before I was ever born. I learned that the 3 guards who had died before me were each killed inside their own private chambers, at night, with no witnesses and no evidence left behind beyond a single mark on the skin that the royal healers could never quite explain. "A poison," Ilona told me quietly when I finally asked. "Or so the healers believe. Something rare, something that leaves no trace once it has finished its work. Whoever is responsible does not wish to be caught, and so far they have succeeded completely." Any pattern to who they served or where their rooms were located? "All 3 guards served the princess directly, as you now do. Beyond that, no pattern the council has been able to find." I turned that information over in my mind for days afterward, mapping the palace not as a place of beauty, which it certainly was, with its high arched ceilings and gardens grown from plants I had never seen before, but as a battlefield, with hidden lines of attack I had not yet learned to see. The council, for their part, made their displeasure known in ways both subtle and direct. During my first formal appearance beside the princess, at a gathering meant to introduce new appointments to the noble houses, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes settle on me the moment I stepped into the hall, and none of those looks were friendly. A tall noblewoman with sharp cheekbones and robes the color of deep violet approached us first, her gaze sliding over me like I was something unpleasant tracked in on someone's boot. "Your Highness," she said, bowing with exact and practiced grace toward Ysara, before turning her attention to me with far less warmth. "I understand congratulations are in order. You have found yourself a human pet." "Lady Cyril," Ysara said, her voice pleasant but edged. "This is Nathan Cole, my personal guard. I would ask that you address him with the respect his position requires." "Respect," Cyril repeated, as though tasting an unfamiliar word. "For a prisoner rescued from execution. How very generous of you, cousin." I recognized the word cousin, and understood in that moment that the woman standing before me was likely one of the very people who stood to benefit most if Ysara's guard continued to die on schedule, and if Ysara herself eventually followed them. "If you have concerns about my qualifications," I said, keeping my voice level, "you're welcome to test them yourself, Lady Cyril. I'm told the position has an opening rate of about 1 guard every month. I'd hate for you to miss your turn." A ripple of shocked murmurs passed through the nearby nobles. Cyril's eyes narrowed, though something like reluctant interest flickered behind the anger. "Careful, human," she said. "Court is not the battlefield you are used to. Words here can cut as deeply as any blade, and you do not yet know the shape of the knives around you." "Then it's a good thing I've spent my whole life learning how to survive around sharp things I couldn't see coming," I said. Ysara's mouth twitched, the closest thing to open amusement I had seen from her since the cell, though she smoothed her expression quickly before Cyril could notice. Cyril gave a stiff, shallow bow and withdrew, robes sweeping across polished floor as she moved to rejoin her own circle of allies across the hall. "You should not provoke her," Ysara said quietly, once we were alone again near the edge of the gathering. "You said I needed to stop being frightened," I said. "Seemed like a good place to start." "There is a difference between courage and recklessness, Nathan Cole. Learn it quickly, or it may be the thing that finally gets you killed." I took her warning seriously, even if I did not let it show on my face. Over the following nights, I stopped sleeping in the guest quarters offered to me, and instead walked the palace corridors long after the court had gone quiet, memorizing every guard rotation, every servant's passage, every place where a person might slip through unseen. I found 3 routes into the royal wing that the official patrol schedules did not account for, hidden behind old service doors that had likely gone unused for generations. I made note of each one, and I made sure to check them again every single night after that. I also began watching the princess herself more closely, not out of suspicion, but because protecting someone properly meant understanding their habits, their routines, the small unconscious patterns that made them predictable to anyone hunting them. She rose early, walked the eastern garden alone, before her advisors arrived to fill her day with arguments and demands, and read reports late into the night in a private study lit by a single lamp. It was during one of those late nights, standing quietly near her study door while she worked, that she finally asked the question I had been waiting for since the cell. "Why did you agree to this?" she said, without looking up from the documents scattered across her desk. "You could have chosen the pit instead. Some men would have preferred a quick ending to an uncertain one." I considered the question carefully before answering, because the pit was already decided for me by people who never once asked what I wanted. This, I gestured at the collar around my neck, at the quiet study, at the entire strange arrangement I now found myself inside. This is the first thing since the war ended that felt like my own choice. She finally looked up at me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "Then let us hope your choice proves to be a good one," she said softly, "for both our sakes." Outside the study window, the palace gardens sat still and dark under an unfamiliar sky, and somewhere beyond the walls, in a place I could not yet see, someone was already beginning to plan how the next guard would disappear. I did not know it that night, but I would not have longed to wait before I found out exactly how they intended to try. The attack came on the 9th night, and I felt it before I understood it, the way soldiers learn to feel danger long before their minds catch up to explain why. I had been standing outside the princess's private chambers, half in shadow near the old service corridor I had discovered during my nightly rounds, when the air itself seemed to shift. The palace at that hour was always quiet, but this was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before something breaks it. I did not draw a weapon. I did not call out. I simply moved, sliding back into the darkness of the service passage, and waited. A figure came through the hidden door, exactly where I expected one eventually would, moving with the careful, practiced silence of someone who had studied this palace as thoroughly as I had, though clearly from a different set of lessons. He was Caliph, tall and lean, dressed in a dark uniform stripped of any house markings, his face partially covered by a thin dark wrap that left only his eyes visible. He did not see me at first. That was his mistake. I let him pass 2 steps into the corridor before I moved, closing the distance between us before he could turn, driving my forearm across his throat and pulling him backward off balance in one motion. He was strong and trained, twisting hard against my grip with a speed that told me he had fought before and won more often than he had lost. But he had trained for a different kind of enemy, someone who fought with the elegant, ritualized forms the Caliph warriors practiced, all measured strikes and honorable distance. I had not learned to fight that way. I had learned in mud and rubble and collapsed buildings, where the only rule was that there were no rules, and the winner was whoever was still breathing when it ended. He drove an elbow back toward my ribs, and I twisted with the blow instead of against it, letting it slide past me while I hooked my leg behind his and drove him down into the narrow corridor wall. He hit it hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs, and before he could recover, I had pinned his weapon arm against the stone, forcing the blade from his fingers with a sharp twist that made him hiss through his teeth. "You picked the wrong door tonight," I said quietly, keeping my voice low so it would not carry beyond the corridor. He did not answer. Instead, he drove his head backward, aiming for my face, a move I had half expected, and turned away, from just enough that it only grazed my shoulder instead of connecting fully. I answered with a sharp strike to the side of his knee, buckling his leg beneath him, and finished by driving him face first against the corridor floor, one arm locked hard behind his back until he stopped struggling. "Who sent you?" I asked, pressing just enough weight against his shoulder to keep him still without causing lasting harm. Silence. "You can answer me, or you can explain yourself to the princess directly," I said. "I imagine she has far less patience than I do." Still nothing, though I felt the tension in his body shift, calculation replacing the initial panic of being caught. I heard soft footsteps approaching from the main hallway and turned my head just enough to see Princess Ysara herself standing at the entrance to the service corridor, wrapped in a simple sleeping robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, and an expression on her face that was somewhere between shock and something I could not quite name. "You were not meant to be awake," I said, immediately regretting how it sounded, like I was scolding royalty in the middle of an ambush. "I heard movement," she said, stepping closer despite the obvious danger, her eyes fixed on the man pinned beneath me. "Is that—" "An uninvited guest," I said. "He came through the old servant passage on the eastern side. Doesn't look like council issue. No house markings." Ysara knelt slightly, careful to stay out of arm's reach, and studied the man's face with a coldness I had not seen from her before. "Remove his mask." I did, revealing a face I did not recognize, though the princess's sharp intake of breath told me she did. "Voran," she said quietly, "you serve House Kessel." The man finally spoke, his voice rough with pain and something like resignation. "I serve whoever pays for results, Your Highness. Nothing personal in the work itself." "Nothing personal," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "3 of my guards are dead because of work that was nothing personal." "4. They hoped," Voran said, glancing toward me with something like reluctant respect flickering behind his eyes, though this one proved more difficult than expected. "Who paid you?" I asked again, pressing slightly harder against his pinned arm. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind his expression, before he finally spoke. "I was told only that the client wished the human guard removed before the succession ceremony. Payment was arranged through an intermediary. I never met the one who hired me directly." "Convenient," Ysara said. "Truthful," Voran replied. "Whoever hired me was careful enough not to leave a trail. I imagine that was rather the point." I looked to Ysara, waiting for instruction, uncertain exactly what the customs of this palace demanded in a moment like this one. Back on Earth, an intruder caught in the act of attempted harm against a head of state would have faced immediate and severe consequence, likely without much conversation involved at all. But I had learned enough about Caliph politics in the past 9 days to understand that the correct response here was not always the obvious one. "What happens to him now?" I asked quietly. Ysara considered the question carefully, studying the man on the floor with an expression that had shifted from shock into something far more calculating. "If I have him executed quietly, House Kessel denies any involvement, claims he acted alone as a rogue agent, and nothing changes. If I have him executed publicly, House Kessel calls it tyranny, uses his death to paint me as a ruler who silences dissent through violence rather than justice, and turns council sympathy further against me before the succession ceremony even begins. So neither option helps you." "Correct," she looked at me directly, "but you have already given me a better option than either of those, Nathan Cole, without perhaps realizing it. How's that?" "You did not kill him," she said. "You could have. It would have been easily justified, an intruder caught mid-attack against royal quarters. No council in this dominion would have questioned the guard's right to defend his charge with lethal force. And yet he is alive, humiliated, disarmed by a single human guard the entire court has been mocking for 9 days." I began to understand where she was heading. "You send him back." "I send him back," she agreed, a slow, sharp smile finally breaking across her face, the first real smile I had seen from her since the moment we met. Alive, unable to deny what happened, carrying the story of his failure directly into the halls of House Kessel himself. "Let them explain to their own allies why the human prisoner defeated their trained assassin without so much as drawing a blade. Let every house in this court hear exactly how that story ends." Voran's expression shifted from resignation into something closer to genuine alarm. "Your Highness, if you send me back like this, House Kessel will see it as an insult far worse than execution. They will. They will understand precisely what I intend for them to understand," Ysara said, cutting him off with a calm that carried more weight than any shout could have managed. "That the next assassin they send after my guard, or after me, should expect the same treatment, or worse. Choose your next assignment with far greater care, Voran of House Kessel." She rose to her feet and looked to me. "Release him." I hesitated only a moment before easing my grip, allowing the man to slowly climb to his feet, cradling his injured arm against his chest, his eyes darting between the two of us, like he was still trying to calculate some way out of the humiliation waiting for him. "Tell your masters," Ysara said, her voice carrying the full weight of royal authority now, "that the human they underestimated is not going anywhere. Tell them the ceremonial guard position they hoped would remain empty, or filled with someone easily removed, now belongs to a man who has already survived what 3 trained soldiers before him could not. And tell them that I am watching very closely to see who tries next." Vorin bowed stiffly, pain evident in the motion, and retreated back through the service passage he had entered from, disappearing into the dark corridors of the palace without another word. I watched him go, my pulse still elevated from the fight, my shoulder throbbing where his earlier strike had landed. Ysara turned to study me once he was gone, her expression unreadable again, though something in her posture had shifted, something that had not been there before that night. "You are hurt," she said, nodding toward my shoulder. "It's nothing." "It is something," she said, stepping closer and reaching out before catching herself, her hand hovering just short of touching me. "You fought an assassin trained since childhood in the arts of combat, and you did not kill him, though every instinct in this palace would have told you that was the safer, simpler choice. Killing him wouldn't have solved your problem," I said. "You needed a message sent, not a body buried." Figured that out somewhere around the moment his knee gave out. Most soldiers do not think that clearly in the middle of a fight for their own survival. Most soldiers didn't spend a war learning that the fight itself is rarely the whole battle, I said. Sometimes what happens after matters more than what happens during. She studied me for a long moment, something thoughtful and quiet passing behind her eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Nathan Cole." I try to keep it interesting. The ghost of that earlier smile returned briefly before she composed herself again, straightening her sleeping robe and glancing back toward her private chambers. "Get that shoulder looked at by the healers before morning. I suspect it will not be the last injury you collect in my service, but there is no reason to let the first one go untreated out of stubbornness." "Yes, Your Highness." She paused at the doorway to her chambers and looked back at me one final time that night. "Tonight was a test, Nathan Cole, though I suspect you already understood that. House Kessel wished to see whether the Council's collar would stop you, whether fear alone would make you hesitate at the critical moment, or whether you would fold the way the others might have. You did none of those things." "Wasn't really thinking about the collar in the moment," I admitted. "Wasn't thinking about much of anything except getting between him and that door." "That," she said quietly, "is precisely why I chose you." She disappeared into her chambers, leaving me alone in the corridor with my racing heartbeat and a growing certainty that Vorin's failure that night would not be the end of it. Whoever had truly ordered his attack would not simply accept a single humiliating defeat and walk away. If anything, I suspected the coming nights would only grow more dangerous, not less, now that the court understood I was not the easy target they had hoped for. I made my way to the healer's wing as instructed, my shoulder aching with every step, my mind already working through everything I had learned that night. Vorin had come through a passage I had already identified and watched closely, which meant either my other hidden routes remained unknown to whoever hired him, or House Kessel had simply picked the option that seemed most convenient without realizing how carefully I had already mapped the palace around me. Either way, I intended to be ready the next time someone tried, and something told me, as I sat beneath the healer's careful hands letting them tend to the bruising along my shoulder, that the next time would not be far off, and it would not come from a single direction alone. Word of Vorin's failure spread through the palace faster than I expected, and within days the whispers about me had changed shape entirely. Where servants had once looked at me with pity or open contempt, I now caught them glancing sideways with something closer to caution, sometimes even curiosity. Nobles who had ignored me completely during my first week suddenly found small reasons to speak with me directly, testing my responses, measuring my temperament, trying to determine whether the story traveling through the court had been exaggerated or understated. Lady Cyril, in particular, seemed to study me with a new intensity, whenever our paths crossed, her earlier contempt replaced by something colder and more calculating. I did not trust the change. If anything, it worried me more than her open hostility had. "They are no longer trying to remove you quietly," Ilona warned me one afternoon, as she helped adjust the fitting of my formal uniform ahead of an upcoming council gathering. "A quiet failure is forgivable. A public one, told and retold across every noble house in this dominion, is a wound to pride that some of these houses will not simply absorb and forget." "So what happens next?" "I do not know," she admitted, "but I would not expect them to try the same approach twice." She was right to worry, though even she could not have predicted exactly how the next attempt would unfold. It began on a night nearly 2 weeks after Voron's failure, a night that started ordinary enough that I nearly missed the signs building around it. The princess had attended a smaller gathering earlier in the evening, a private dinner meant to smooth relations with several lesser houses ahead of the coming succession ceremony, and I had stood at the edge of the room throughout, watching faces rather than listening to conversation, the way I had learned to do in every gathering since my arrival. Something about the evening felt wrong from the start, though I could not immediately place why. It took me nearly an hour to realize what was bothering me. 3 separate servants I did not recognize had crossed my line of sight during the dinner, each one appearing only briefly, before vanishing back into the palace's endless service corridors. Palace staff rotated on predictable schedules I had already memorized during my nightly rounds. These 3 did not belong to any rotation I knew. I said nothing during the dinner itself, not wanting to cause alarm without evidence, but the moment Ysara retired to her private wing for the night, I pulled her personal healer aside quietly and asked her to check the princess's evening meal and drink for anything unusual before she consumed any more of it. "You suspect poison," Ysara said later, once we were alone in her study, her expression sharp with understanding rather than fear. "I suspect a lot of things tonight," I said. 3 servants I've never seen before, appearing and disappearing at exactly the moments I wasn't watching closely enough. That's not coincidence, that's planning. Planning for what exactly? I don't know yet, but I'd rather find out before it happens than after. The healer returned within the hour, her expression grim as she reported traces of a rare compound found within the sauce served during the final course of the evening's dinner, a substance that would have caused no immediate symptoms but would have proven fatal within days, slow enough to avoid immediate suspicion, and difficult enough to detect that it might never have been traced back to its source at all. "They almost had you," I said quietly, once the healer had gone, leaving Ysara staring at the empty plate that had nearly ended her life without a single dramatic moment attached to it. "Almost," she agreed. "Had you not noticed those servants, I likely would not have survived the week. We need to move you somewhere secure, tonight. There is nowhere in this palace more secure than my own private wing, Nathan Cole. Moving me now would only tell whoever is responsible that their poison failed, giving them time to prepare an alternative before we understand the full scope of what we are facing." She was right, though I did not like it. Instead, I spent the following hours quietly repositioning what limited resources I had. I could not trust the standard palace guard rotation, not after learning that at least one house had already managed to plant unfamiliar staff within a private royal dinner without detection. Instead, I relied on what I had built myself over the previous weeks, the hidden passages I had mapped, the blind spots I had identified, the timing of every patrol that moved through the royal wing. It was well past midnight when the first sign of real trouble arrived. I caught movement near the eastern garden entrance, a section of the palace grounds that connected to the royal wing through an old servants' gate rarely used since the current wing had been renovated generations earlier. A figure moved along the garden wall with a strange, shifting quality to their outline, as though the darkness itself bent slightly around them. Cloaking technology. I had heard whispers of such devices among the Caliph military during my time as a prisoner, expensive equipment reserved for only the wealthiest houses, capable of bending light around a moving figure well enough to fool most eyes in poor lighting. I did not have time to feel impressed by the technology. I moved quickly toward the servants' gate, positioning myself in the shadows where the cloaked figure would need to pass to reach the royal wing, and waited with the kind of patience that came from years of learning to hold still while danger approached. The figure passed within arm's reach without seeing me, and I struck fast, aiming not for the figure directly, but for the device I guessed was strapped somewhere along their back or shoulder, generating the bending light around them. My hand found a small mechanical unit fixed just below the neck, and I tore it free in one sharp motion. The cloaking shimmer collapsed instantly, revealing a lean, armored figure who spun toward me with startled fury, clearly not expecting to be discovered so quickly, if at all. We fought in near silence, both of us aware that raising an alarm too soon might scatter whatever plan was unfolding that night before I fully understood its shape. The intruder was fast, faster than Vorin had been, clearly selected for stealth rather than raw strength, but speed alone was not enough. I used the narrow confines of the garden gate against him, denying him room to maneuver, forcing exchanges close enough that his speed advantage meant little. I finished the fight by driving him hard against the stone archway, pinning him firmly enough that further struggle only risked injury he clearly did not want to risk for a mission already gone wrong. "One down," I muttered under my breath, securing his hands with a length of cord from my belt and dragging him into the shadow of the garden wall, where he would remain hidden until I had time to deal with him properly. I had barely finished when a soft alarm chime sounded from my earpiece, a signal I had arranged earlier that evening with the healer stationed near the royal wing's main entrance. Someone had been spotted near the princess's private study. I moved fast, cutting through the garden and back into the palace through a side corridor, my mind racing through every possible outcome. If there were multiple attackers moving simultaneously, tonight was not a single assassination attempt. It was several, launched together, likely by different houses who had each grown impatient enough to act at the same time, perhaps even without knowledge of one another's involvement. I reached the corridor outside Ysara's study to find a second intruder already inside, a bribed member of the household staff I recognized distantly from the kitchens, standing frozen near the princess's desk with a small blade drawn, clearly caught in the moment of hesitation between committing to violence and losing his nerve entirely. Ysara herself stood on the opposite side of the room, perfectly still, her eyes locked on the blade rather than the man holding it, her expression calm in a way that told me she had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, even if she had never expected to face it in her own study. "Put it down," I said quietly from the doorway, not wanting to startle him into a decision he might not otherwise make. The servant's eyes flicked toward me, panic flashing behind them. "I did not want this," he said, his voice shaking. "They threatened my family if I refused. I was only meant to signal the others, not to." "Then put the blade down," I said again, slower this time, "and we can discuss exactly who threatened your family, and I promise you, they will regret it far more than you will if you set that knife aside right now." For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. Then the blade clattered to the study floor, and the servant sank to his knees, hands shaking, tears finally breaking free as the fear he had been holding back gave way all at once. I crossed the room quickly, securing him the same way I had secured the cloaked intruder in the garden, while Ysara remained still, watching the entire exchange with an expression that had shifted from calm control into something more thoughtful. "Two," she said quietly, once the servant had been restrained. "You said one down in the garden. That makes two tonight." "There may be more," I said. This wasn't one house testing us again. This was several, moving together, probably counting on us being too stretched to catch all of them before something worked. As if summoned by my own words, a third alarm sounded, this one from the outer wall surrounding the royal wing's eastern approach, the same section where I had already dealt with the cloaked assassin only minutes earlier. "Stay here," I told Ysara. "Lock the study door behind me and do not open it for anyone but my voice specifically." "Nathan," she said, stopping me before I reached the door. Be careful. Always am. I moved quickly back toward the eastern wall, where a third figure had apparently attempted to scale the outer barrier using equipment clearly meant to bypass the palace's usual detection systems, only to find the alarm I had quietly installed days earlier along that section, one of several small precautions I had taken without informing anyone, simply because old instincts told me redundancy saved lives. The third assassin was already retreating by the time I arrived, clearly realizing the attempt had been detected, but I closed the distance before they could disappear back over the wall, catching hold of a trailing cord attached to their climbing gear and hauling them back down onto solid ground with enough force to knock the wind from their lungs. This one fought harder than the other two combined, clearly the most skilled of the three, someone chosen specifically for a mission expected to require real combat if discovered. We exchanged blows across the narrow stretch of garden path, my shoulder still tender from the earlier fight with Vorin, screaming in protest with every strike I absorbed, until finally I managed to catch his balance wrong during a driving kick, sweeping his legs out from beneath him and pinning him hard against the cold stone path. By the time I dragged the third attacker back toward the royal wing, binding his hands as I had the others, the sky beyond the palace towers had already begun shifting from black toward the deep gray that precedes true dawn. I was bruised, exhausted, and running on nothing but adrenaline and stubbornness, but all three intruders were secured, and Ysara remained safe behind the locked door of her study, exactly where I had left her. I knocked in the pattern we had agreed upon, and the door opened to reveal her standing exactly where I had last seen her, though something in her posture told me she had not simply waited idly during the hours I had been gone. Several documents lay spread across her desk, notes written quickly in a hand that suggested urgency rather than calm reflection. 3, she said, looking up at me as I stepped inside, exhaustion evident on my face despite my efforts to hide it. 3 attempts, in a single night, launched close enough together that I do not believe this was coincidence. Someone coordinated this. Or several, someone's grew impatient at the same time, I said, sinking into a chair across from her desk, without waiting for permission, my body finally protesting the night's efforts now that the immediate danger had passed. Either way, we have 3 sources sitting secured just outside this study, and I imagine they'll have quite a lot to say once they understand exactly how much trouble they're actually in. Ysara studied me for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her expression, equal parts relief and something far heavier, something that looked almost like fear finally catching up to her now that the danger itself had passed. "You could have died tonight," she said quietly. 3 times over, in 3 different corners of this palace, entirely alone, while I remained safely behind a locked door, doing nothing more useful than writing notes no one may ever read. "I didn't die," I said. "That's what matters." "This time," she said, "but we cannot continue relying on fortune alone, Nathan Cole. Whoever ordered tonight's attempts will learn of their failure by morning, and I suspect the response that follows will not simply be another round of quiet assassins in the dark." She was right, though neither of us yet understood exactly how dramatically the coming morning would change everything between us, and everyone watching from beyond that study door. By the time the sun fully cleared the eastern towers, the 3 attackers sat bound and silent in a small chamber adjoining the royal study, guarded not by the palace's regular soldiers, whom neither of us fully trusted after the events of the previous night, but by 2 of the healers Ysara knew personally and had sworn to secrecy until she decided how to proceed. I stood near the chamber door, arms crossed, studying the 3 prisoners while Ysara paced slowly behind her desk, turning over the decision that lay ahead of her with obvious care. The cloaked assassin from the garden refused to speak at all, his expression carved from stone despite clear discomfort from the restraints holding him. The bribed servant from the kitchens had already told us everything he knew through broken, tearful admissions, revealing that his family had been threatened by an intermediary working on behalf of a minor house seeking favor with a larger one, though he did not know which house stood at the true center of the plan. The third attacker, the skilled climber I had caught scaling the eastern wall, remained tight-lipped, though something in his posture suggested calculation rather than loyalty, a man weighing his own survival against whatever silence he had been paid to keep. 3 different methods, Ysara said, half to herself, half to me, as she studied the notes she had compiled overnight. Poison in the meal, a bribed servant with a blade, and a trained infiltrator using cloaking technology few houses could afford. This was not a single house acting alone, Nathan Cole. This was several, moving independently, perhaps unaware of one another, all reaching the same conclusion on the very same night. That the ceremonial guard finally needed to go, I said, and that maybe I needed to go with him. Precisely. She set the notes down and looked at me directly, exhaustion and something sharper mixing behind her eyes. Which means the council chamber this morning will already be filled with houses expecting to hear that their attempts succeeded. When they learn instead that all 3 failed, and that all 3 attackers are alive and secured within my own private wing, the reaction will be significant. So what do we do with them? She was quiet for a long moment, studying the 3 bound figures through the open doorway between rooms. Execution would satisfy some, and enrage others equally. It would give the involved houses grounds to claim persecution, to rally sympathy from houses not yet involved, painting me as ruthless before the succession ceremony even begins. That is precisely the outcome they would prefer, if their assassins must fail. And if you just let them go, then I appear weak, unable or unwilling to respond to attempts on my own life, which invites further attempts far sooner than 3 failed assassins might otherwise inspire. So neither option works, I said. Same problem as with Voron. Yes, she said slowly, and I could see an idea forming behind her expression, sharpening into something with real edges. Which means, as with Voron, the answer is neither execution nor release. It is something quieter and far more effective than either. She explained her plan over the following hour, and the more she spoke, the more I understood exactly why the council had underestimated her for so long, and exactly why they would never make that mistake again after this particular morning. Rather than executing the 3 attackers publicly, or returning them humiliated as we had done with Voron, Ysara arranged for all 3 to simply disappear from the palace entirely before the morning council session began. No bodies. No public statement. No formal accusation against any specific house, which would have required evidence neither of us currently possessed, and which would have given the accused house grounds to demand a trial they could stall indefinitely through political maneuvering. Instead, the 3 attackers were quietly transported off-world entirely, delivered under heavy secrecy to a remote outpost within Ysara's personal holdings, far from any court influence, where they would remain indefinitely under careful watch, unable to communicate with whoever had hired them, unable to confirm or deny anything regarding what had truly happened that night. By the time the council gathered that morning, word had already begun spreading through the palace, whispered urgently between servants and nobles alike, though no one could confirm any specific detail. 3 attempts had been made against the princess and her guard during the night. All 3 had failed completely. And now, as morning arrived, all 3 attackers had simply vanished, along with any evidence of who had sent them or what had truly happened in the dark hours before dawn. I stood at Ysara's side as she entered the council chamber that morning, and I watched the faces of the assembled houses carefully, the way I had learned to do since my very first night in this palace. Lady Sorrel's expression remained composed, though I caught the faintest tightening around her eyes as the whispered rumors reached her before the formal session even began. Other nobles exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncertain how much of the previous night's rumors held truth, and unsettled by the uncertainty itself, far more than they would have been by clear, confirmed information. "I understand there were disturbances within the royal wing last night," an older noble finally said, once the formal session opened, his tone carefully neutral despite obvious curiosity beneath it. "There were," Ysara said simply, offering no further detail. "And the nature of these disturbances?" "Handled," she said, as all threats against this crown will continue to be handled, swiftly, and without need for further discussion in this chamber." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could feel the tension in the room shifting, uncertainty replacing whatever confidence certain houses had carried into that meeting, expecting different news entirely. No one dared press further, not without evidence of their own to bring forward, and evidence was precisely what Ysara had ensured would not exist. The message could not have been clearer if she had spoken it directly to every house gathered in that chamber. 3 attempts, launched in coordination, aimed at removing both the human guard and potentially the princess herself, had failed entirely, and the price for that failure was not martyrdom, not public trial, not evidence anyone could use to rally sympathy or outrage. It was simply silence, absence, and the unspoken understanding that further attempts would meet exactly the same fate. After the council session ended, Ysara and I walked together through the palace gardens, the same gardens where I had caught the cloaked assassin only hours earlier, now bathed in soft morning light that made the entire scene feel almost peaceful, despite everything that had happened beneath the same sky only a short time before. "You did not sleep at all last night," she observed, studying the exhaustion clearly written across my face despite my efforts to hide it. "Neither did you." "No," she admitted, "though I suspect for very different reasons. I spent the hours after the 3rd alarm rewriting nearly every plan I had for the coming weeks, understanding finally just how outmatched the Council's usual methods of protection truly were against houses willing to act with this level of coordination." "You mean me," I said. "You're saying I outmatched them. I am saying," she corrected gently, "that a soldier trained to fight within rules, honor, and ritual will always struggle against an opponent who understands that survival rarely respects any of those things. The houses of this dominion have spent generations perfecting duels, fought with elegant blades and careful, honorable distance. They had no answer prepared for a man who learned to fight in collapsed buildings and desperate circumstances, where the only rule that mattered was staying alive long enough to protect what needed protecting." I considered her words carefully as we walked, the events of the past weeks settling into place with a clarity I had not quite reached before that morning. "You knew this would happen," I said slowly. "Not the specific attacks, maybe, but you knew choosing me instead of another trained soldier would force everyone around you to face something they weren't prepared for." "I hoped for it," she admitted. "I did not know for certain it would work. I only knew that continuing to lose guard after guard to the same predictable methods was a path that would eventually end with my own name added to that list, and I refused to simply wait for that outcome without trying something the council would never have approved." "So you gambled on a condemned prisoner?" "I gambled on someone who protected a stranger during his own transport toward execution, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return," she said. "That told me more about your character than any record of military training ever could have." We walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the palace slowly waking around us, servants beginning their morning routines, nobles retreating to their private quarters to process whatever conclusions they had drawn from the morning's council session. I found myself studying Ysara's profile as we walked, understanding for the first time just how carefully she had been playing a game far larger than anything I had initially understood, even while carrying the weight of genuine danger and genuine fear beneath her calm royal composure. "What happens now?" I finally asked. "With the 3 who vanished, with the houses who sent them?" "Now," she said, "every house in this dominion understands that attacking my guard, or attacking me, carries a cost they cannot predict or control. No bodies to mourn publicly, no evidence to build a case around, no martyrs to rally sympathy behind, only silence, and the unsettling knowledge that their chosen agents simply disappeared, with no way to know for certain what became of them. That's a cruel kind of mercy. It is the only kind of mercy that keeps us both alive long enough to see the succession ceremony completed," she said. "Cruelty would have been execution, weakness would have been release. What I chose instead was neither, and I suspect it will prove far more effective at discouraging future attempts than either extreme could have managed alone. I thought about the three attackers, transported quietly to some distant outpost within her personal holdings, alive but isolated, their fates now entirely dependent on decisions Ysara alone controlled. It was not the ending I would have chosen back when I still thought in terms of soldiers and simple battlefield outcomes, but I understood, standing in that quiet garden with the morning light growing warmer around us, that this was not a simple battlefield, and Ysara was fighting a war that required weapons far more complicated than the ones I had trained with. "You're better at this than you let the council believe," I said finally. "They believe what serves them to believe," she said. "A young princess, inexperienced, desperate, making a foolish choice out of pity for a condemned prisoner. Let them continue believing that for now. It has already served us well once. I suspect it will serve us well again before this is finished." "Us," I repeated quietly, testing the word. She glanced at me, something warmer than simple gratitude passing behind her expression. "Yes, Nathan Cole. Us. I did not choose you merely as a guard to stand outside my door and absorb whatever violence came looking for me. I chose you because I recognized, even in that first moment inside your cell, someone who might understand what it feels like to be underestimated by everyone around them, and to use that underestimation as a weapon rather than a weakness." I did not have a ready answer for that, so I simply nodded, understanding that whatever this arrangement had begun as, a desperate trade between a condemned man and a princess surrounded by knives, it had become something else entirely over these past weeks. Something neither of us had fully expected when she first stepped into my cell and chose me from among the prisoners scheduled to disappear that same night. The collar remained around my neck, still glowing faintly along its edge, still officially capable of ending my life the instant I raised a hand against her, according to everyone in that palace except the two of us who knew the truth. I no longer thought of it as a threat. I thought of it now as something closer to a promise, a quiet acknowledgement between us that whatever came next, we would face it together, rather than as prisoner and princess, guard and ruler, human and caliph. The succession ceremony still loomed ahead of us, weeks away, filled with its own dangers I had not yet begun to fully understand. The houses who had lost their agents that night would not simply accept defeat and retreat quietly into obscurity. If anything, I suspected the coming weeks would bring challenges far more dangerous than anything a lone assassin slipping through a garden gate could manage, challenges that would test not just my ability to fight, but Ysara's ability to rule, and both our abilities to trust each other completely in a court built entirely from suspicion and hidden knives. But standing in that garden as the sun rose fully over the palace towers, three assassins quietly removed from the board, without a single drop of blood spilled where anyone could see it, I found myself feeling something I had not expected to feel again after the war that had taken everything else from me. Something close to hope. "Rest today," Ysara said finally, turning to walk back toward the palace, her earlier exhaustion giving way to renewed purpose now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You have earned it, and I suspect you will need every bit of strength you can gather before whatever comes next arrives at our door." "And what do you think comes next?" She paused at the garden entrance, glancing back at me with an expression that mixed determination with something almost like affection. "I do not know precisely," she admitted, "but I know this. Whatever it is, I no longer intend to face it alone, and I do not believe you intend to let me, even if the entire council and every house in this dominion decides to stand against us both." "No," I agreed, following her back toward the palace as the last of the morning mist burned away beneath the rising sun. "I don't intend to let you face any of it alone." Behind us, in the quiet chamber where three attackers had spent their final hours within the palace, before being quietly transported away forever, the morning light fell across empty restraints and an untouched breakfast tray, the only remaining evidence that anything unusual had happened there at all. By the time the council next gathered, no trace remained of the previous night's chaos, no bodies to examine, no confessions to extract, Nothing but rumor and uncertainty spreading quietly through a court that had finally begun to understand exactly what kind of guard and what kind of princess they were truly dealing with. 3 assassins had come in the darkness, confident in their numbers, their training, and their coordination. By morning, all 3 had simply vanished, and the silence they left behind spoke louder than any execution ever could have.